Silas Olofson. I come from the Faroe Islands, and I'm primarily going to show you pictures today and talk about the birds of the Faroes. Here you see the map of the North Atlantic, and the Faroe Islands are located about 400 kilometers northwest of Shetland, 400 kilometers, 500 from Iceland, and 600 from Norway. So it's situated quite isolated in the middle of the North Atlantic, and the landscape, as you can see on this picture, is mountainous. It's volcanic origin and has no wild forests, for instance, and it's mostly made up of rocks and grass and short grass. Here is a view from the highest mountain on the Faroe Islands, Slataratindur, which is 882 meters high, and actually the altitude of 500 and over is considered Arctic climate, whereas it's temperate further down. And it also means that we have quite different birds at different places. Here you see some of the steep western cliffs, which are home to typical seabirds like puffins, fulmars, which are the most common birds on the Faroe Islands, and also common guillemot and kittiwakes, and all of those birds that you associate with the seabirds, also in Scotland and in the UK. But for the last 100 years, people have been planting plantations as well. So now there are some plantations that are maybe a few square kilometers, the biggest ones, but mostly during autumn migration, for instance, it's small gardens like you see here on these pictures that attract a lot of people. And this photo I actually took when the baleen strike was sitting in the bushes there. So autumn birding, which is something really, really, really exciting on the Faroe Islands, is like looking into the gardens of people, and everything can show up. Here you also see a typical small village on the Faroe Islands. This village has almost no gardens, but then you can find the birds on the beach, often looking for food in the seaweed, or you find the birds in an area like this where you have a lot of wheat. And this area, for instance, had a light street warbler and yellow-browed warbler when I took this picture. And it's, yeah, so that's kind of the birding condition that you see. And when you look at a picture like this, you can kind of imagine that the Faroe Islands, with all the steep hills and mountains, work like tracts. So a lot of the birds are just coming into these small villages and into the areas with the tall grasses, and that makes birding actually quite a lot easier compared to places like in Europe, where the birds could just vanish pretty much into anything. Here on the Faroe Islands, they seem to congregate on rather small, suited areas. So that's what it looks like, just to give you an impression on how what the Faroe Islands look like. And I started bird watching myself when I was very young, and I twitched my first bird when I was 10, and it was a flock of pale-bellied brants that my biology teacher had found in the morning, and I got a little upset with him for not telling me early on, but first after school he told me about them. But he said that, well, I would probably skip school to go looking for them if he had told me right away. So that was quite fun. But anyways, he was a really good teacher and really good at, inspiring me to go bird watching. And so I've pretty much been doing it since. And then when I was 13 years old, I bought my first camera because I found a bird in the garden that I couldn't identify, probably a Borneman's Arctic redpoll. Um, but didn't have any proof, and it yeah wasn't accepted by the Danish Rarities Committee, which takes care of all the rare records of birds on the Faroes. So I bought a camera, and since then I've also taken bird pictures. Yeah, the Faroe Islands are yeah a quite interesting country. There are no native land-based mammals on the Faroe Islands. Because it's so isolated. But Arctic hare, Raptors norvegicus, the brown rat, and mice have been introduced, and of course now you have also more sheep than you have people, and there are a few horses and cows, but there are no native mammals at all. But in the ocean, you can see like the gray seal, you can see the walrus when you're lucky. This bull was actually visible from my kitchen window. Quite nice. And of course, you can see a lot of species of whales as well. But it's still very limited what you actually can see when it comes to mammals on the Faroe Islands, unless you're doing whale watching far offshore, which is also quite interesting. But when it comes to birds, it's something really, really different. Here we have white-crowned sparrow from North America. I found it in the garden of a former prime minister who has allowed me to go into his garden and look as much as I want. And yeah, this is a young bird in autumn. Maybe, just maybe, it's suggested that it's a western subspecies that normally lives in Alaska. And if it's true, well, it has flown quite a bit, of course, before it landed on the Faroe Islands. So when you go out birding in autumn, you can find small American passerines. But what was really interesting in this garden of the prime minister was that at the same time there was a yellow-browed warbler, and the yellow-browed warblers breed in Siberia. So it comes from the total opposite direction. So the Faroe Islands are like a typical East meets West place where you find both American birds and you find birds from the East. And just this year has been quite good for me. We spent the year back home due to COVID, and I got to spend the last half year actually working on board longliners, doing bycatch research and bird research for the Faroese Marine Institute, and it was really nice. But when I was home in late spring, I found this first Eastern Bonelli's warbler from the Faroe Islands, which is quite a nice bird, not the most extravagant looking one, but just as boring as it might look, just as rare it is. I think there are maybe one or two records from Shetland and at least less than 10 from the UK. So that was a nice one. I also found the first Western Bonellis for the Faroes a few years ago. So that was a nice one. And just a few days later, I found the first Eurasian stone curlew for the Faroe Islands. The Eastern Bonellis warbler lives in a quite small area in Turkey and Iran and winters in Sudan, whereas the stone curlew, except for a few pairs in southern England, it's mostly a South European species, North African species. So it was quite surprising to find one of these on the Faroe Islands, but I was really happy. And also this year was the first record of Russ's goose, which was seen on the second westernmost island, two birds that looked really well. But they have been accepted into category by the Danish Veritas, which means that they could be wild, but they could also be of feral origin or domestic origin. They did look really good though, and they came after a lot of westerly winds, but I don't know about the credentials. They probably need to have a American ring. Normally, they breed in the Arctic, Canada, these small white geese. So that's quite good for actually a period of 1 month to see eastern bonellis, Ross's goose, and the stone curlew. And that kind of summons it up. That the funny thing about birds is that they all have wings, and most of them are able to fly. And here is a sanderling that is showing all its bling. I found it on the second easternmost island of Fauna, which is my favorite island. And it turned out that it was actually ringed all the way in down in Ghana. So that's quite nice. And that's what's so interesting about birding is that the birds migrate, and you never know what will turn up the next day. But the Faroe Islands are also quite isolated, and therefore not all birds are migrating. For instance, the Faroese wren has developed into a special subspecies only found on the Faroe Islands, and we have the same with the wren populations on other islands and archipelagos in the North Atlantic, where the Faroe Island or the Faroese wren is somewhat darker, somewhat bigger, and I think somewhat shorter winged than the European or mainland European subspecies. It's also the second smallest birds on the Faroes, but it's breeding bird. It's really common. Only the goldcrest, which has started to breed in recent years in connection with the plantations growing, is smaller than the wren. But it's like an ultra local bird, and even research shows that they even don't like uh, to uh, to fly from one island to another. So you almost have island populations of Faroese wren. And then we have the birds that you could call partial migrants, like the merlin. Some of the merlins migrate well, where some of them are staying all year round. And it's interesting to see how their migration coincides with the migration of northern reindeers that they like to catch and eat. Otherwise, merlins are the only raptors or birds of prey that breed on the Faroe Islands, because most raptors are reluctant to fly long distances over the ocean, and therefore the records of raptors are quite few and far between. And also the landscape as a whole makes it really difficult to actually spot the raptors. The white-tailed eagle used to breed on the Faroe Islands, but was considered a menace because it was eating the lambs, it was abducting all the babies, and actually, if you shot a white-tailed eagle on the Faroe Islands, you were freed from paying tax for a lifetime, and that is quite tempting for many people. So the white-tailed eagle got extirpated in the 18th century on the Faroe Islands. In the last years, sightings have become more regular again. So let's hope that it would come and start breeding again. One raptor that is, well, not annual, but at least you see it a few times every now and then, is the osprey. And this autumn, we had a really nice juvenile osprey that came in early October and was still actually present in November, where it was feeding off trout in a valley called Saxon. So that was quite an experience to be able to see osprey this well. And I still remember 16th of September 2013, because that was when our youngest son was born. And when I was driving home from the hospital to be with the two daughters, an osprey flew over my car when I reached the bridge. And it was just during a really bad low pressure from the west. And even though I didn't get really good pictures, people see quite are deem it quite likely to be North American osprey of the Carolinensis subspecies, which has only been recorded a few times in the Western Palearctic. So that's quite cool. We also have some birds that winter on the Faroe Islands, and this autumn I was really happy because I don't know if you know the term boogie bird, but snowy owl has been my #1 boogie bird. 22 years ago, I attempted my first switch, and when we reached the area, we saw something white on a pole just 2 kilometers away, but we're not able to tell for sure what it was. So we drove a little closer, and a really heavy shower came, and when we got to the pole, there was nothing white on it. The next opportunity I got, that was before we had like texting, and cell phones. We left the area. We had waited for 2 hours and we left, and 20 minutes later, the snowy owl appeared being mocked by a gear falcon. That's also quite bad. And when I went on vacation, a snowy owl was seen 7 kilometers from my house for a week, and it disappeared the day before I came home. So I went to Lapland to try to see it on breeding grounds, but that year it was breeding at a different place, so I didn't see it there either. And when my wife went into labor with our oldest daughter, a friend found a snowy owl 30 kilometers from our house. I chose to stay at the hospital and missed the one-day wonder of the snowy owl there. But finally this year, it worked because some shepherds found a snowy owl at the same place where one was seen last year. And it was this stunning male snowy owl. The males are getting almost all white, but only a few scattered black spots. And it actually seems to winter far up in the mountains at a quite inaccessible place. So it comes to the Faroes to kind of spend the winter, and it most likely lives of mountain hares, which are really common in the area. Another bird that is only wintering on the Faroe Islands is the ruddy turnstone. Here is the breeding plumage bird. It looks really nice. And ringing recoveries have shown that they actually breed all the way up at Ellesmere Island. Here is the standard winter plumage, and it's eating some kind of sea snail. But it breeds all the way on the green island that you can see north of Greenland, Ellesmere Island, and it flies straight across the ice of Greenland. So it's quite a cool bird, I think. Yeah, and we also have the same thing with the great northern divers, that they winter quite commonly around the Faroese shores, but they don't breed on the Faroe Islands. So you can see especially juveniles also during summer. Otherwise, they breed in Iceland and North America. Then we have the Bohemian waxwings, which are a bird that comes in invasions, very much dependent on the availability of fairies in northern Scandinavia and Russia. And some years you just see hundreds and hundreds of these really beautiful Bohemian waxwings, which are also quite interesting because normally they come in late October and they like to eat the rowan berries, but the rowan berries have fermented often at that time, so it's not uncommon to to see birds that have just come and they're just really, really, really hungry and they eat all the rowan berries and then they kind of get drunk and just fall down to the ground. So you can actually pick them up. So that's quite interesting. And yeah, their migration is totally dependent upon the availability of food sources. And I think this year we haven't I haven't heard of any waxing on the Faroe Islands at all. And then you have a bird like this red kite. Um, During spring, if you have nice southerly winds, you get some birds that just simply fly too long because it's very easy for them to migrate, and all of a sudden they end up on the Faroe Islands. It's just like when you're riding a bike; it's much easier for you to get forward if you have strong winds um, from the back, and you just reach your goal really fast. And I think it's much the same with the birds. If you have really good southerly winds and like warm, high pressure winds, you get crazy stuff like red kites flying all the way to the Faroe Islands. And there's even a record of Bonelli's, no, not a Bonelli's eagle, a booted eagle from Iceland. So there can happen some pretty crazy stuff during spring when the weather is really good. And we had those kind of conditions a few years back where during a weekend of birding, we found uh, a 98 different bird species of the Faroes, which is really quite good for one weekend. Um, and that year there was even a breeding attempt of subalpine warblers that stayed at the same time. Male was displaying, female was seen up, and they were nest building and everything, and they stayed all during all the summer, even though uh, um, the chicks were never seen, but they were attempting to breed at least. So that's also something that can happen on the Faroe Islands. And then you have springs like this year where it was just freezing all the way into June, and yeah, it was really nothing like like spring oversuit shoot kind of weather. But then we got some late easterlies, which really delivered. And then you have some birds that only come when it's really bad weather. These are nuts, red nuts. They're regularly seen on the Faroe Islands in small groups, and a few of them also winter. Um, but all of a sudden, during spring hurricane, 650 of these were just landing on a single beach in a village, and it was quite quite an astonishing sight, and nothing we're used to in the Faroe Islands at all. So that was quite cool. And now we're at the really interesting stuff because autumn is the month of or the time of magic on the Faroe Islands. A few years back, I found this Pallas's grasshopper warbler on the island of Spuina, which is my favorite island. The whole island is 4 times as big as Fair Isle, so it's well, I can't check it all on my own, but I can check it well enough to find quite a few good birds. And I found this Thales grasshopper warbler there, and it shows the interesting fact that you see Central Asian species really quite regularly, or yeah, Siberian species quite regularly on the Faroe Islands during autumn. And I don't think anyone knows exactly why it's happening. It has been proposed that it's reverse migration, that the birds that come should originally fly southeast from breeding grounds in Siberia to Southeast Asia, but instead they try to cross or they fly northwest and try to cross the globe in order to reach uh, their wintering grounds, just simply flying um, the completely wrong direction. So like the map has been turned upside down in their head. It's also been suggested that these birds come from areas with irregular, unstable magnetism, which has kind of messed with their ability to navigate. And in order to check this, a friend of mine was making actually a PhD a few years back, and we were ringing birds on the southern tip of the Faroe Islands. And the bird you see in the picture here is a barred warbler, which is remarkably common on the Faroe Islands. It's not uncommon during arrivals in autumn to find maybe 5 barred warblers in a single village. So it's remarkably common. But it only breeds, there's a really small remnant population in Sweden. Otherwise, it breeds in Poland and actually all the way to Western Mongolia. So it's very much a Central Asian species and pretty much quite uncommon in most of Western Europe. What we did was that we put some small radio trackers on the birds, so we were able to find out what direction they moved when they left the Faroe Islands. And all of the barred warblers, without exception, migrated west or northwest from the southern tip of the Faroes, which will lead them to Iceland or Greenland or North America. And of course, since it's a bird primarily eating insects and stuff like that, well, it's not doing really well in late October in Iceland or in Greenland. So it's believed that these birds are just migrating to their death. We even had one really crazy bird. The barred warbler is quite a big Sylvia warbler, so it's quite a bodybuilder in that it has a lot of self-confidence, and it flew out and headed northwest from the Faroe Islands, and it was like almost 20 meters per second from west. So it was really eager to go, and it was they really wanted to go west or northwest from the Faroes. And then we caught quite a few of the much more common black caps, and they breed in Scandinavia and migrate over the North Sea. And in connection with easterly winds, you can get quite big arrivals of these birds. I've had up to 60 in one village. And we also tracked them to see where they were going. And all of them were heading southwest instead of northeast. So they were not doing this reverse migration or going the wrong direction. And they also actually stayed longer in the village in order to build up their fat reserves. Because we caught several birds several times, and we could see that they were improving their health, and they were simply calculating that now they need to eat quite a lot, and then they migrate southeast and end up probably in Shetland or Scotland or Orkney, and then just probably follow Britain and to the wintering quarters in southern Britain or Africa or southern Europe. So there was a huge difference between the barred warblers and the blackcaps. Another bird that we checked was the yellow-browed warbler, and it was exactly the same as the barred warbler. All of them migrated west or northwest from the Faroe Islands. So they really were trying to get to the northwest, and that is really, well, it's sad for the birds, obviously, but it also accounts for the regularity of many Asian species that logically should not occur at all on the Faroe Islands or in Shetland or Scotland, Wales, Western Norway, Iceland. And yeah, And as you see here, there's a map of the Faroe Islands and Shetland and the Hebrides and Orkney. Um, and yeah, I just wanted to compare a little bit because, if you want a bird on the Faroe Islands and have a bad day, you should just look at all the things they see in Shetland during September, October, because they get so many birds. Um, and I don't really know if I have a lot of explanations for why Shetland gets many more birds, but of course it's almost 400 kilometers further out, so it needs more persistent easterly winds to get to the Faroe Islands, and when that happens, we equal Shetland at least in numbers of birds seen. But then, if the birds also come from the uh, southeast, they simply just hit Orkney and Shetland before they get to the Faroe Islands. But it's quite interesting also that, for instance, Oriental turtle dove that spent, I think, almost a month in Shetland um, a few years back. I found it a few days later on the Faroe Islands, the exact same bird. And so there's some movement between the Faroe Islands and Shetland as well. And I think that some of the birds doing reverse migration after resting on Shetland. Well, the logical thing would be that they, at least potentially, could reach the Faroe Islands after a stopover. And it also explains why we see quite a few winged birds like lesser white-throats, yellow-browed warblers, and so on. And it's probably from the ringers in Scotland or maybe in Norway. I don't know. The white-crowned sparrow, the North American bird that I told about, is also quite interesting because the day after I found it on the northernmost tip of the Faroe Islands Weary, the same bird was found on Fauna, and it could also be identified as the same individual because of the fact that there were some small broken feathers and so on. So you could actually be absolutely certain that that bird had taken the trip from the northern tip of the Faroes to Fauna the day after I found it. So that's quite interesting as well. And there's a huge difference also. This autumn, I was the only person regularly going out to look for migrants on the Faroes, and so it would pretty much equal that I should check Fair Isle, Faula, and all of the mainland and honest myself. And of course, the result in Shetland would also be quite poor if there was only one bird going out. So the Faroe Islands is an ideal place to go if you want to find your own stuff and you have to work with your own stuff and not just switching the birds of other people. And that can be seen here. I actually found now 25 new species for the Faroe Islands, and there are some quite good ones amongst them, like thick-billed, pipe-billed grebe, and lanceolated warbler, Pallas scroper, American black duck, both eastern or both species of, or not the alternate, the eastern subalpine and the western subalpine warbler, eastern Bonelli's warbler, western Bonelli's warbler, and so on. And finding so many new species to the Faroe Islands, well, I don't think that would be possible in any other country in Western Europe. And when I take my Faroese list, it's 94% of the birds that are actually self-found on my list. And that's quite nice, even though I twitch whenever I can. There's something that I haven't seen before. Yeah. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about climate change and how it's affecting the Faroe Islands. Because we have, for instance, the common guillemot, and I received a really interesting thing from Greenland, where you can see the population development from 1990 to 2007, where all of the southern colonies are decline or in a severe decline, whereas only the northernmost population is growing. But actually, the growth of that population is bigger than the decline of the all of the other populations. So the population as a whole is actually um, growing in Greenland. And we tend to see some of the same on the Faroe Islands that uh, this even though it's so small, populations on the northernmost islands are doing better than to the south. And we also see that fairly recent birds have come, like the European robin, which did not used to be a Faroese breeding bird, has come from the south because now it's warm enough and now there's good enough environment for it to thrive on the Faroes. And now it's quite a common bird. Uh, and here we have a locally produced juvenile, which looks nothing like the adult. Then we have like the iconic puffin, which is well still a common bird, but um, sadly it has been declined a lot. There are no complete counts of the puffins, but we know how many have been hunted. And in year 1900, 200,000 puffins were hunted per year. That was down to 150 just before the war. And in 2000, it was still 100,000 per year. And 2010, it was only 339 per year. So the hunting numbers showed that the population has declined a lot. And now, luckily, it's protected in many areas, and only a few birds are caught each year. But they are really not doing that well. And we don't know what the explanation is, but the sand eel don't seem to be doing really well. And yeah, and the sand eel even seem to move further offshore. Birds have been seen carrying sand eel as far as 100 kilometers offshore, and it's just way too far for the puffins to get enough food for their chicks. So there have been quite a few bad years for the puffins, though it has been looking a little better during the last 4 years. And then we have the fulmar, which started to breed on the Faroe Islands less than 200 years ago. And that population has just exploded. When I used to work in a big trawler, you know, the whole ocean around the trawler was just completely white with fulmars. And now that has become the number one hunted bird on the Faroes. And maybe 100,000 fulmars are caught each year. And here you see a picture from around a fishing vessel where the fulmars are fighting over fish intestines. And here's a juvenile fulmar. And mostly it's the juveniles that are caught with like a big net offshore. Um, Another bird that is really hit by the global warming is the snow bunting, which used to breed on the Faroe Islands and has not been confirmed as a breeding bird for almost 40 years. Though I actually did found one breeding pair this year, and it was literally 20 meters under the summit of the highest mountain of the Faroe Islands. And it is estimated that the population has been declining quite a lot, both in the US and due to global warming, because it really likes cold weather where there's not so much competition between with other species. And here we have the nice, beautiful male. And you can just see that it really likes the cold. But on the other hand, the purple sandpipers seem to enjoy that it's being warmer, and they have increased in numbers also on the Faroe Islands. And also further north, because they now have more places where they can forage and find food and nest. So some species really gain from the global warming as well. And basically, it comes down to birds being either specialists or generalists. And uh, the the herring gull, it's a really good example of a generalist. It can eat both the ice cone, but it's also quite good at finding its own fish. Whereas the Eurasian wimpole has really high demands for its area to nest in. It has to be not too dry, not too wet, not too tall grass, not too short grass. And you need to have the special food items and so on. And if that kind of habitat is not present, they're not breeding there. And we have at least the Eskimo curlew and standard-billed curlew that have been wiped out during the last centuries. And Alaskan Bristol type curlew is also doing really bad. And yeah, so some are, sorry, some are afraid that the Wimpro and the Eurasian curlew, this is a Wimpro, so maybe I mixed it up before. Um, well, could be the next ones, next victims to global warming because their habitat will change for too much. On the Faroe Islands, we also have a problem with feral cats because unlike Europe, where many passerine populations have adjusted over thousands of years to weasels and stouts and cats, the Faroese populations of, for instance, storm petrels don't have any protection mechanism against cats, so that's quite a big challenge as well. Also, the Manx shearwaters are suffering from wildcats, and of course, all the passerines that are taken. And you really see a huge behavior difference between birds from islands where there are cats and where there are no cats. Yeah, so that's also a problem. We also have increased tourism, which leads to the decline of many birds nesting out in the wilderness. Arctic skua here. Uh, no, yeah, Arctic skua is just trying to protect its nest from some visiting tourists. So that's also a problem where we need to get protected areas in place, and we're not really good at that at the Faroes. Also, you see often eiders with fishing hooks, oil pollution, and it's quite common for the oyster catchers to be tangled up in sheep wool, and that's also quite sad, to be honest. We also have plastic pollution. The microplastic is present in quite high numbers in the fulmars that have been checked. And here you have a young gannet that has, well, thought that maybe a bag of potatoes was some really nice yellow fish, and now it's entangled up and it's just gonna die because there's no way of catching it unless it's really, really weak and already too weak to survive, probably. And then we have sheep, and sheep are quite, well, quite a danger to birds. There's a study from Shetland that showed that sheep during the period of 10 years ate more than 600 chicks and eggs from Arctic tern, and also ate the chicks and eggs of Arctic skua and so on. But also they grass heavily, and here you can see a quite telling picture. The area to the right is a protected area where you can have the heath growing, and there are some willows, because there are actually original willows on the Faroe Islands. They're just being almost extirpated by the sheep. But there are some protected areas where the willows still are, and you can see the difference between how the soil is actually doing, where the sheep are grazing to the left, and the area is protected to the right. So we have a lot of area that's just way too heavily grazed, and it makes it just much worse habitat for the golden plover, for the oyster catchers, for the wimbulls, and all of the birds that live in those kind of peaty areas. I'm gonna end this presentation because I've been working for the last half year on longliners to find out about bycatch, how many fish are actually, not how many birds and other animals or not intended animals are actually caught on the longliners. Uh, it was really interesting to be able to to sail because it's basically like you're just chumming all day, throwing things out in order to get the birds. And now in order, yeah, so you get a lot of birds just following the um, the ship because all the intestines of the fish are just discarded. And here we have a great skua. It's one of my favorite birds because it has a very limited distribution in Scotland and Scotland and Faroe Islands and Iceland, a little bit in Svalbard, and a little bit all over to Novaya Zemlya. But it's the main population is actually right here: Scotland, Faroe Islands, Iceland, um, and it's just cool to have 50 of those hanging around the ship, and they're just good at stealing from all the other birds. Here you can see a gannet that's not so happy and top right, and it actually just pierces the great skua. And it's just such a beautiful and elegant bird. Um, if you go 150 years back, it was heavily persecuted on the Faroe Islands, and there were only 4 years, 4 pairs left. But now it's actually still being persecuted, and people go to the colonies and shoot them just because of the, well, an old-fashioned mindset. But we still have now maybe 600 to 800 pairs, and they're doing well. And here we have a nice bright version with some white mascara around the eye. It's quite common for them to have these kind of white patches every now and then. And the one thing that they're really afraid of, and that's the fulmars, because the fulmars can puke on them, and the fulmars take on this really crazy defense position if the great skuas get too close. Here it's catching a little bit of squid that's used for bait on the hooks, and here also it's just really into it. And I was really happy to have up to 21 marine skuas during May, just passing the Faroe Islands. It's really recorded on the Faroe Islands, but obviously there's north going passage during spring, and it just looks really nice with those elongated tail feathers. And being out in the ocean and just having them pass right next to the ship. It's really cool. And it's quite a different kind of skua because it breeds in northern Russia, for instance, and lives during breeding season off of lemmings, small hamster-like animals. And here we have the fulmar, a close-up picture, a nice, most common bird on the Faroe Islands, with the tube nose that makes it able to drink salt water and pour out the salt so it can stay out at sea for as long as it wants. And it's also really good at smelling. And on the big trawlers, you can see up to 50,000 birds around one ship. So it's really common. Here you see a typical picture of the fulmars just fighting for food around the longliner. Sometimes you see the odd pale bird, like this one. It's really quite white. And here you see the defense position when the great skuas get too close. Quite a nice one, feisty bird. And then you have the dark blue fulmars, which are more common the further north you get, but around the Faroe Islands, it's fairly common, and the bottom bird in the bottom is like intermediate. It's not really pale, it's not really dark, whereas the one in the middle is quite dark. And sometimes, just sometimes, you have good weather for a few hours, and then it's wonderful to be at sea. Here we have a gannet just diving on the water. It becomes just like a torpedo, and it can catch fish down to a depth of almost 20 meters. So it's quite amazing. And sometimes you see some with a broken bill, and if the same birds dive for the same fish at the same time, there could be quite a collision there. And they're quite interesting because in their way of often getting the liver, and especially the liver, they dive down and then they come from below and snatch it from the full horse from below, because that's totally unexpected. And of course also gives some really odd alien-like photo opportunities when they just reach the water. And here you have some greater blackback gulls, some juveniles, and nice looking gannet eating. And the smallest fish that are discarded, the gannets are also fighting over those. And they're really good at swallowing remarkably big fish, because their bill can also open horizontally, so they're able to swallow quite big fish and quite big pieces of intestines. And then we have the lesser blackback gulls, which are really quite pelagic, and they are always around the boats as well during the summer season. And they use their advantage of speed. They're really fast at diving and trying to snatch something out of the bill of gannets or fulmars. And here's a close-up eating, well, we call it kingfish. I don't know what's called in English. And yeah, they're really happy when they get the big chunks of food. You can see just how happy the bird is. And there's always a lot of noise around the boat because the birds are constantly calling. And sometimes they are challenged to swallow the really big fish. They just don't want to go out. But yeah, just a really, really beautiful bird. Again, here you can see that it doesn't have the tube nose or the nostrils compared to the fulmar. Yeah, another one just swallowing a small ling. I think it's called in English. And it also seems like a lot of them are pairs, because they tend to do also mating display and showing some signs of romance even at sea. And if the rival is coming too close, it's not too popular. So there can be quite some feisty fights out there. And sometimes when the seas are rough, you also get some really strange photo opportunities, like a Medusa gannet with different heads. And sometimes there's so much competition that the fish are actually able to escape. Here it's a great blackback gull trying to snatch the fish. Yeah. Here it's also just looking happy about eating. Unfortunately, we regularly see birds with oil pollution also at sea, so that's quite sad. And basically, it's just a death sentence when that happens. And here, if you look really well, this gannet has been caught by a hook that you can see in the neck, and there's probably a big chunk of infection inside. And that one is also definitely gonna die sooner or later. So that was pretty much my presentation. Now, if you have some questions, I would be happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Silas, for that. I'll give you a moment to take your headphones off if you want to go back to your computer audio. just let me know when you can hear us again.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, I can hear you. All right.
Oh, have you
Go
got
on,
a question
Steve.
there, Hennes? No, I was just going to say fantastic, Silas. Yeah, really, really lovely.